The letter arrived just after sunset, when the street outside was settling into its evening hush, and the lamp on the writing desk breathed a soft yellow pool across the wood. Emily Harold held the envelope as if it could burn through her fingers. The seal was unfamiliar. There was no return address, only her husband's name written in a tidy hand that pretended to be respectable. John tore it open with the short, careful motion of a man who mistrusts surprises. He read it once, without a change in his face. Then he read it again, slower, as if the words might turn into different words if he granted them the dignity of time. When he finally set the paper down, the room grew colder, though the lamp still burned and the stove still ticked. "Someone says you have been meeting a former president," he said. "Someone says there is shame in our house." Emily heard the sentence as if it had been spoken through glass. The name was there on the page, undeniable, heavy as a brass weight. She noticed the wobble in the lettering, the smudge where the writer had blotted a mistake. Then she felt the larger thing, the thing that made her breath come short. There are accusations that do not ask to be proved. They only ask to be believed. "It is a lie," she said, and found that her voice was calm. "It is a lie signed by no one." John looked at her with the formal politeness a man gives to a neighbor, not to a wife. "Anonymous or not," he said, "the world will read it with a signature." He folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, as if returning a knife to its sheath. He did not touch her. He did not accuse again. He simply took his hat from the peg and said he needed air. Emily heard the door catch and settle, and in that sound was the first small crack that later would become many. By morning, the letter had done what letters do when they are written for the street instead of the heart. The grocer's wife paused when Emily entered the shop, then pretended to search a shelf that did not need searching. On the church steps, two women stood too close and spoke too softly, and one of them lifted her eyes and flinched when Emily's gaze met hers. There is a way a town can turn without moving. The corners sharpen, the distances lengthen. Emily walked home carrying a loaf and a paper cone of salt, as if she were balancing something unstable. "I have done nothing wrong," she wanted to say aloud, as if the air might carry it to every ear more faithfully than the letter had carried its rot. John came in at noon. He ate without appetite and spoke in statements. The season would be late. The price of coal had risen. The letter lay untouched on the mantel. Emily thought of taking it and tearing it into thin white streamers and feeding them to the stove's mouth. But a rumor is a stubborn thing. Burn the paper and you only make heat. The smoke carries farther than the words. In the afternoon, a neighbor tapped at the door and delivered a pie wrapped in careful cloth. "You look tired, dear," she said, meaning something kinder and something crueler in the same breath. Emily thanked her. When the door closed, she pressed both hands to the pie as if she could push a prayer into it. Late, when the house was quiet, she took out paper of her own and tried to answer the accusation with reason. She listed days and places, the ordinary proof of a life. The Monday sewing circle, the Tuesday visit to her aunt, the Thursday afternoon spent washing curtains. She wrote the name of the former president in her neat hand and felt the oddness of the world. How a woman's reputation could be yoked to a man she had never met by the simple act of ink. She paused, listening for John's footsteps above. Before she put out the lamp, Emily stood at the window. Snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, as if each flake were considering the ground it would choose. She imagined the letter walking through town on its own small legs, climbing stairs, knocking on doors, bowing to widows and merchants, and losing nothing of itself with each telling. She pressed her forehead to the glass and let the cold remind her she was still a body and not a rumor. "Keep watching," she told her own shaken heart. "It only gets deeper when the light grows thin." The days that followed seemed to fold into one another, stitched together by whispers and sidelong glances. Emily could feel the town breathing against her skin. Each morning when she opened the curtains, the street appeared the same. Horses stamping in the cold, children running with red cheeks, women with baskets. But beneath it ran a different current. It was as though every eye asked her a question and refused to wait for the answer. John did not raise his voice. He did not strike her nor curse her. Instead, he became a ledger where affection had once been written. His hands, once quick to touch her shoulder, now remained busy with gloves and hat. He rose earlier, returned later, and when he sat at the table, his words were polished stones, hard, few, and offering no warmth. Emily longed for him to believe her, to let her stand beside him against the tide. Instead, she found herself alone in a house that had become an echo chamber. At night, she would hear his footsteps in the hallway pause outside her door. But the pause never bloomed into entry. She imagined him on the other side, wrestling with the poison of that letter, unable to set it down, unable to hold her with the same certainty as before. One evening, she gathered her courage and spoke. "John, you must know me better than a stranger's ink. You must see that I am the same woman you chose." He looked at her a long moment. "The world does not weigh what I see. It weighs what it hears." His words were not cruel, but they left her colder than cruelty might have. For cruelty is sharp and then passes. Silence and doubt are winter itself. On Sunday, she attended church, wrapped in her best shawl. The pew felt narrow, though no one had moved closer. The minister's sermon on purity seemed to tilt toward her, though he never once named her. When the hymns rose, she sang, but her own voice seemed thin against the walls of judgment. She thought of leaving midway through, but to leave would have been an admission, and to remain was a torment. She remained. After service, a neighbor's boy ran past and whispered something to another child, who laughed, covering his mouth with both hands. Emily felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She reached for her prayer book as if it could shield her, but it was a frail wall against the weight of rumor. Back at home, she tried to busy herself with ordinary tasks, mending a hem, polishing the lamp glass, baking bread. Yet, in each action, there was the same intruder. The knowledge that somewhere, in some parlor, her name was being broken into pieces and passed around like sugared nuts at Christmas. Night deepened, and with it, her solitude. John slept in the adjoining room, the door between them firm as a wall. Emily lay awake, listening to the wind at the shutters, and wondered how long a woman could stand beneath the pressure of suspicion. She thought of the letter again, the crooked lines of ink, the malice coiled in every curve. Whoever had written it had known exactly what it would do, had trusted the town to finish the work. Emily pressed her hands together and whispered into the dark, "God, let the truth be enough." But the dark remained unmoved, and her prayer felt like a pebble tossed into a well without bottom. "I have done no wrong," she told herself. "Yet wrong has chosen me." Winter thickened around the town, and Emily felt as though each day settled a heavier cloak upon her shoulders. Snow lay crisp on the rooftops, But inside her home, the air carried a draft colder than the wind outdoors. The distance between her and John had grown into a canyon neither seemed willing to cross. She watched him from the window one afternoon as he walked across the yard to the shed. His step was deliberate, his figure outlined against the snow. Once, she would have opened the door and called to him, asking if he needed tea or company. Now she only watched, silent, fearing that her voice would meet him like an echo rather than a welcome. That evening, he spoke of accounts, of debts and payments, of practical matters that had no place for tenderness. She longed to break through the veil, to remind him of laughter they had once shared. Yet each attempt to draw him into warmth met with a wall of reserve. The townspeople's judgment had deepened into ritual. On her way to market, Emily noticed women pausing at stalls, their eyes fixed on ribbons or fruit while their ears leaned toward whispers. A man tipped his hat too formally, as though his courtesy were not for her, but for the idea of propriety itself. Even children grew bold. A pair of boys ran past chanting a rhyme they must have overheard from their mothers. The words stung not for their wit, but for their cruelty. Emily returned home with her basket half full, her dignity thinner than the shawl around her shoulders. In the parlor, the letter still rested on the mantel, its presence as heavy as a stone. She considered again burning it, but the thought came with dread. Ashes can be scattered, but rumor clings. One night, John confronted her with a weary steadiness. "Do you swear before God and me that none of this is true?" Emily's voice broke as she answered, "I swear, John, by the life in my veins and the vows I made." He studied her with eyes that searched for cracks. At last he nodded, though his nod carried no triumph. "Then may God judge the one who wrote it. But the town does not wait for his verdict." The silence that followed was worse than accusation. It was resignation, the slow acceptance that their marriage had become a house with walls, but no hearth. In her loneliness, Emily turned to writing. She filled pages with thoughts, dates, small proofs of her days. She wrote letters to no one, explanations to a world that would never read them. The act gave her a fragile sense of control, as if by putting ink to paper she could push back against the falsehood ink had first unleashed. But each night, as she folded the pages and hid them in a drawer, she felt the futility. What strength has truth when the crowd has chosen its tail? The weight pressed harder upon her chest. She began to walk through the rooms of her home as though they were corridors of judgment. The mirror in her bedroom no longer showed her face, but the face the town had drawn for her. A guilty woman, marked not by deeds, but by suspicion. And in that reflection, she began to wonder how long she could endure. The first thaw of March came late. Yet even with the sun bright on the snow, Emily felt no warmth. The ice was loosening along the gutters, but her days were frozen in place. Each morning she rose, dressed carefully, and went about her tasks with the dignity of ritual. It was the only shield she had left. Composure in the face of a world that had decided its verdict. Neighbors came less often. Where once there had been visits and shared tea, there was now absence. When she did receive company, the talk circled politely around weather and prices, avoiding the raw wound at the center of her life. Emily answered with courtesy, but she felt as though she were performing a part on a stage that had only one scene. John spoke to her little. His evenings were spent at meetings, and his footsteps in the hall no longer paused outside her room. She began to measure their marriage not by tenderness, but by the distance between his words. Once she had believed that time could heal suspicion, But the days only proved that doubt was more enduring than affection. One night she heard him mutter in his sleep the name of the man whose shadow had been written into that cursed letter. She sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding. Even dreams had turned against her. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered to the silent walls, "I have never even met him. Yet he lies between us in this bed of absence." By spring, the rumors had taken root so deeply that Emily could feel them even in church. When she walked the aisle to her pew, shoulders stiff and chin lifted, the hush that followed seemed louder than any hymn. The minister's words on virtue rang like a tolling bell, and she sat with hands folded, enduring each note as if it were struck against her own heart. One afternoon, she ventured to her aunt's house, hoping for refuge. But even there, the welcome carried weight. Her aunt's smile was thin, her eyes searching. "You must be strong, Emily," she said, pressing her hand. "Time will prove what is right." The words were kindly meant, but they carried the sting of doubt. If family needed proof, what hope was there among neighbors? That evening, alone in her chamber, Emily took from the drawer her hidden pages. She read over the record she had kept, each line a defense, each date an alibi. The sight of her own careful script filled her with both pride and despair. Pride, because it was truth. Despair, because truth had no witness willing to believe. She set down her pen and stared at the lamp flame. The thought came quietly, like a visitor who had been waiting at the door for many weeks. Perhaps there's only one way to silence the rumor forever. Her hand trembled as she reached to snuff the flame. Darkness folded over her like a cloak, and within it, her resolve began to take shape. The following days passed with a strange calm, as if Emily had crossed a threshold invisible to all but herself. She went about her tasks with precision, dusting the mantel, tending the fire, sewing by the window. Yet each movement carried the gravity of farewell. She greeted John with the same courtesy as always, but inside her heart was emptying, preparing itself for the silence it believed must come. She walked once more to the market. The air was brisk, the streets muddy with thaw. Children splashed through puddles while their mothers scolded, and men raised their hats in stiff acknowledgement. Emily moved among them like a figure in glass, seeing but untouched, heard but not answered. A neighbor's woman gave her a pie again, the crust golden and neat. But Emily felt it was more pity than kindness. That night, John spoke briefly of a business trip he might take. His words landed without weight. Emily nodded, her eyes lowered. She wondered whether he would grieve if she were gone, or only sigh at the removal of a burden. Later, she stood before the mirror in her room. The candlelight painted her face in soft tremors. She studied herself, the high cheekbones, the tired green eyes, the youth still clinging to her, though sorrow had aged her spirit. She whispered, "I am innocent." And for a fleeting moment, she believed the glass might answer back. But it offered only silence. She returned to her desk and unfolded her secret pages, the diary of her defense. She read through the lists of dates, the careful proofs, the names of women she had visited, and times she had spent in ordinary tasks. The logic of it was unassailable. Yet logic had never been her enemy. It was malice, and malice did not surrender to reason. Emily placed the pages in a neat stack, tied them with ribbon, and set them in a drawer. A record for no one, perhaps, but a testimony for God if he chose to read it. That evening, she wrote one more note, her hand steady. She did not address it to John, nor to the town, but to the nameless accuser whose ink had altered her life. The words were plain. You have won. My voice cannot reach beyond your lie. She folded the note, left it without seal, and placed it atop the pile of her writings. The next morning dawned pale and gray. Emily dressed carefully in her light Victorian gown, the one with lace at the collar. She braided her chestnut hair, pinned it with precision, and stood for a long while by the window, watching the world stir awake. A carriage rattled by, and a boy hurried past with a bundle of newspapers under his arm. Life continued. Indifferent. When John came downstairs, he found her seated at the desk, her hands folded, her head bowed as if in prayer. For a moment he thought she was simply waiting for him. Then he saw the stillness, absolute and unbroken. The candle at her side had burned itself out, leaving only a thin line of smoke. Emily Harold had chosen silence. The letter had taken her voice, and now it had taken her life. The town would speak of her for weeks, some with sorrow, others with satisfaction. John carried himself like a man carved from stone, answering condolences with nods, avoiding questions with measured quiet. The letter remained, yellowed at the edges, a weapon that had done its work. And so her story ended, not with proof, nor with justice, but with the echo of words never hers to claim. The funeral was held on a raw April morning. The church bell tolled slowly, each strike a weight upon the hearts of those gathered. Women in dark bonnets pressed gloved hands to their mouths. Men bowed their heads stiffly, as if mourning a principle rather than a person. John walked behind the coffin with steps measured and silent. His face unreadable, his eyes fixed ahead, as though afraid to look either to the past or the future. Emily's coffin was simple, pine polish smooth, adorned with a spray of lilies. Inside, she lay dressed in her pale gown, her hair braided neatly, her face calm as if at last she had found a place where whispers could not reach. Some said she looked angelic. Others said it was a pity such beauty had been wasted on scandal. Even in death, the town could not resist weighing her as though she were a matter of commerce. The minister spoke gently of forgiveness and the mystery of suffering. His voice carried over the pews, solemn yet distant. For those who believed Emily guilty, it was a warning. For those who doubted, it was a balm. For John, it was neither. He sat unmoving, his hands clasped, his heart locked in a chamber where grief and doubt waged a quiet war. Afterward, in the graveyard, the coffin was lowered into the earth. The thud of soil against wood echoed like a verdict. Emily's neighbor, the woman who had once brought her pies, dabbed her eyes with a kerchief. "Poor girl," she murmured. Though whether she mourned Emily's life or her reputation, none could say. As weeks passed, the town's talk moved on. New scandals rose, new names were whispered. Yet the memory of Emily lingered in certain corners. The grocer's stall where she once stood, the pews she had filled with her quiet presence, the window where she had leaned her forehead against the glass. For some, she became a cautionary tale. For a few, a martyr of rumor's cruelty. John lived on in that house, but the rooms seemed hollow, their warmth carried away with her breath. Sometimes he stood before the drawer that held her writings, the neat stack of pages she had left behind. He could not bring himself to read them. To do so would be to confront the measure of his doubt. And he feared what it might reveal about his own failure to trust. In the years that followed, the story of Emily Harold became less a scandal and more a ghostly echo. Children who had once chanted cruel rhymes grew into adults who barely remembered her name. Yet now and then, On winter nights when the snow fell soft and steady, an old neighbor would pause by her grave and recall the young woman with chestnut hair and green eyes and whisper a prayer for peace. For in the end, Emily's truth was not carried by the town, nor written in its ledgers. It remained in the silence of her final act, a reminder that a single letter, ink on paper, nameless and faceless, can destroy what love and years had built. And to those who still remembered, her life spoke a quiet warning. Words can wound more deeply than any blade, and innocence, once questioned, may find no shelter in a world eager for scandal. Spring returned in full, with blossoms on the apple trees and children chasing kites across the fields. But for John Harold, the season carried no renewal. The house stood orderly as ever, yet it had the hush of a mausoleum. He went about his work with diligence, tending accounts, speaking with clients. But when he returned each evening, the silence pressed against him like a physical weight. Neighbors still greeted him, some with pity, others with curiosity, yet few dared linger in conversation. The letter that had started it all was gone from the mantel, finally burned one night in a fit of quiet rage. But its ashes, though invisible, seemed to scatter through every room. Occasionally, John found himself staring at the drawer where Emily's writings lay. One late evening, after much hesitation, he opened it. The ribboned stack of pages sat patiently, as if waiting all this time. His hand shook as he untied the knot. Line after line met his eyes. Dates, chores, visits, evidence of a life lived in plain daylight. At the bottom of the stack, her final note rested. "You have won. My voice cannot reach beyond your lie." John pressed it to his chest, a sound breaking from him that was neither sob nor word. In that moment, he knew he had failed her, not by deed, but by doubt. The next day, he carried the pages to the minister and placed them in his hands. "This is her testimony," he said simply. The minister read in silence, then bowed his head. Though the writings would not erase the town's memory, they stood as witness that Emily's truth had been clear all along. Years passed. The scandal faded into the background of history, remembered only in fragments by the oldest generation. Yet among the headstones, her grave remained tended. Fresh flowers laid often, though no one ever saw by whose hand. Some whispered it was John, others thought it was a neighbor moved by guilt. For John himself, the burden never left. He lived into old age, but those who knew him said he carried a sorrow that time did not lift. On certain evenings, he was seen standing by the window, staring into the snow as Emily once had, his hand resting on the sill as if waiting for a presence that would never return. And so the story of Emily Harold endured, not in the records of power or politics, but in the quiet hearts of those who had learned too late the cost of silence, suspicion, and rumor. Her name became a reminder whispered from parent to child. Guard your words, for they can wound beyond repair. Some lives are not lost by illness or war, but by the cruelty of the human tongue. And though Emily's voice was taken from her, her memory continued to speak, a plea for kindness, for truth, for mercy. Long after the letter itself had turned to dust,